A lonely widow bought a homeless man lunch, never knowing he was a billionaire in disguise. The thought replayed in Margaret Wilson's mind as she stared at the crumpled receipt in her trembling hand, wondering how a simple act of kindness had somehow altered the trajectory of her life forever. 3 weeks earlier, on a bitter November morning when the Boston wind cut through her wool coat like it was made of paper, Margaret had stepped into Rosie's diner seeking refuge as much as breakfast. 67 years old with silver hair always neatly pinned back, she carried herself with the dignified posture of someone who refused to let grief bend her spine, even as it hollowed her from within. The 2-year anniversary of Robert's death had passed just days before. 2 years since the heart attack that took her husband of 41 years while he was raking autumn leaves in their backyard. 2 years of eating breakfast alone at their oak dining table, of sleeping on her side, of a bed that never stopped feeling too empty, too cold. "Just one?" the waitress asked, coffee pot already in hand. Margaret nodded, following her to a window booth where cold light filtered through smudged glass. Outside, naked trees swayed in the relentless wind, their skeletal branches reaching toward a colorless sky. "Coffee, please. And the blueberry pancakes." Her order was the same every Saturday morning, though Robert had always teased her about being so predictable. "Live a little, Maggie," he would say, ordering something different each time. As she waited, Margaret's attention drifted to the man huddled in the corner booth. His weathered face was partially hidden behind an unkempt salt and pepper beard, his layers of mismatched clothing hanging loosely on his thin frame. His eyes, a startling blue that seemed out of place in his worn face, darted nervously around the diner. A homeless man, clearly, clutching a tattered backpack to his chest like it contained all that remained of his dignity. She watched as a young waitress approached him, her smile tightening as she took in his appearance. The man spoke so softly Margaret couldn't hear, but she saw the waitress's expression shift to impatience. The man's shoulders hunched further, making himself smaller in the booth. Something in his posture, the way he seemed to fold in on himself, struck Margaret with unexpected force. How many times had she done the same since Robert died? Physical manifestations of an interior collapse. Before she could reconsider, Margaret was on her feet, crossing the checkered linoleum floor. "Excuse me," she said to the waitress. "I'd like to pay for whatever this gentleman would like to order." The waitress raised an eyebrow. The man looked up, those blue eyes widening with surprise and something that might have been shame. "Ma'am, you don't have to," he began, his voice a low rumble, gentler than she'd expected. "I'd like to," Margaret interrupted, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Please order whatever you want." A moment of silence stretched between them, filled with the clatter of dishes and murmured conversations from other booths. "Why?" he finally asked, those blue eyes searching her face. Margaret hadn't prepared for that question. She thought of all the meals she'd eaten alone, of how grief had narrowed her world to routines that kept her functioning but not living. How long had it been since she'd done something spontaneous, something kind, something Robert would have done without hesitation? "Because it's cold outside," she said simply. "And sometimes we all need a little warmth." The man studied her face for a long moment before the corner of his mouth lifted in the suggestion of a smile. "Thank you," he said, the words carrying weight beyond the simple courtesy. "I'm Jack." "Margaret," she replied, and after a moment's hesitation, she slid into the booth across from him. Jack ordered coffee, eggs, bacon, and toast, a simple meal that he consumed with careful, measured bites, as if savoring each morsel. They spoke little during that first encounter. Margaret learned he'd been on the streets for almost a year, though he offered no explanation for how he'd gotten there. She told him about her pancakes, about the diner's good coffee, about the weather forecast predicting snow, safe topics that skimmed the surface of their lives. When they finished, Margaret paid the bill and they parted ways outside the diner. Jack thanked her again, his breath visible in the cold air. "Maybe I'll see you next Saturday," Margaret said, surprising herself once more. Jack's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Maybe you will." She watched him walk away, his stooped figure disappearing around the corner. Only then did she realize she'd spent an entire meal without thinking about Robert's empty chair across from her. The following Saturday, Margaret arrived at Rosie's diner with an anticipation she hadn't felt in months. The disappointment when Jack wasn't there settled heavy in her stomach. She ate her pancakes alone, the blueberries tasting less sweet than she remembered. As she prepared to leave, the bell above the door jingled and Jack stepped in, snowflakes melting in his beard. Their eyes met, and he offered that same slight smile. "Sorry I'm late," he said, sliding into her booth without invitation. "The shelter was giving out new socks this morning. Couldn't pass that up." And just like that, a tradition was born. Every Saturday morning for the next month, Margaret and Jack met at Rosie's diner. Their conversations deepened with each meeting, moving beyond weather and food to more substantial matters. Jack, she discovered, was well-read and thoughtful, with opinions on everything from politics to poetry. He spoke with the articulation of someone who'd once lived a very different life, though he remained vague about his past. "How does someone like you end up—" Margaret's question trailed off one morning, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "Homeless?" Jack finished for her, no bitterness in his voice. "One bad decision at a time, Margaret. Then one day you look up and can't find your way back." She didn't press for details, recognizing in his guarded expressions the same reluctance she felt when people asked about her grief. Some pains were too private to share, at least until trust had been thoroughly established. Instead, Margaret began telling Jack about Robert, about their life together, their small garden, his collection of hand-carved wooden birds, the way he could never remember where he'd left his reading glasses. Speaking of Robert to someone who had never known him made her memories feel fresh rather than faded. "He sounds like a good man," Jack said one morning after she'd recounted how Robert had once spent 3 hours helping their elderly neighbor find her lost cat. "The best," Margaret agreed, surprised to find she could smile at the memory without the usual accompanying ache. "But enough about my past. What about you? You must have family somewhere." Jack's eyes clouded, his fingers tensing around his coffee mug. "I did. Once?" He cleared his throat. "A daughter. Haven't seen her in years." "I'm sorry," Margaret said softly. "My fault entirely," Jack replied, his gaze fixed on some middle distance. "I was different then. Career-obsessed. After her mother died, I didn't know how to be what she needed." He shook his head. "Some mistakes you don't get to fix." The raw regret in his voice resonated with Margaret's own experience of irretrievable loss. Without thinking, she reached across the table and covered his weathered hand with her own. His skin was rough, calloused in ways that spoke of recent hard labor rather than a lifetime of it. Jack looked at their hands, then up at her face, something vulnerable flashing in his eyes before he carefully withdrew his hand. "Tell me about your garden," he said, changing the subject. "You mentioned tomatoes last week?" Margaret allowed the diversion, describing her struggling vegetable patch, the war she waged against persistent squirrels, the satisfaction of growing even a handful of misshapen tomatoes. Jack listened with genuine interest, offering surprisingly knowledgeable suggestions about companion planting and natural pest deterrents. As winter deepened, Margaret began bringing small things for Jack: a new pair of gloves, a thermal coffee mug, a paperback copy of East of Eden. When he mentioned never having read Steinbeck, he accepted each gift with a dignity that made them feel like exchanges rather than charity. In return, Jack brought her small treasures: a perfect pine cone, a smooth river stone, once even a wildflower he'd found somehow blooming through a crack in the sidewalk. "Resilience," he'd said, placing it gently beside her plate. "Reminded me of you." The Saturday before Christmas, Margaret arrived at the diner to find Jack already waiting, an unusual nervousness about him. A small package wrapped in newspaper sat on the table. "You're early," she said, unwinding her scarf as she slid into the booth. "Special occasion," he replied. "Merry Christmas, Margaret." He pushed the package toward her. She unwrapped it carefully to find a small wooden bird, hand-carved with delicate precision. A cardinal, Robert's favorite. "Jack," she whispered, running her finger over the smooth red wood. "How did you—" "You mentioned Robert's collection," he said, watching her face. "I used to do some woodworking before. Found some scraps behind the furniture store on Maple." Margaret cradled the bird in her palm, speechless at the hours of work it must have taken, at the thoughtfulness behind it. Tears welled in her eyes. "If you don't like it," Jack began. "It's beautiful," she interrupted. "It's the most thoughtful gift anyone has given me in years." Relief softened his features. "Everyone deserves beauty in their life, Margaret. Especially you." The words, spoken with such simple sincerity, broke something open inside her. She'd been surviving, not living, letting grief define her boundaries. But sitting across from this man, homeless, struggling, yet still capable of creating beauty, Margaret felt a long, dormant spark reignite. "I have something for you too," she said, reaching into her purse for the envelope she'd been carrying for days, uncertain until this moment whether she would actually give it to him. "It's not as meaningful as your gift, but—" Jack opened the envelope, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock as he stared at the contents. "Margaret, this is a key to my garden shed," she explained, her heart pounding. "I've fixed it up. It's small, but it has electricity, a space heater, a cot. It's not much, but it's better than the shelter, especially in this weather." The words tumbled out in a nervous rush. "Just until you find something better. No strings attached?" Jack stared at the key in his palm, his face unreadable. The silence stretched so long that Margaret began to regret her impulsiveness. "I've overstepped," she said. "I'm sorry, No," Jack interrupted, his voice hoarse. "No one has offered me, not in years." He closed his fingers around the key, knuckles whitening. "Why would you do this for me? You barely know me." Margaret considered her answer carefully. "Because when Robert died, I felt invisible, like I'd disappeared along with him. Our neighbors brought casseroles and said all the right things, but no one really saw me." She met his eyes. "You see me, Jack. And I see you. Not just the circumstances, but the person." Jack's composure wavered, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I don't deserve your kindness." "Kindness isn't about deserving," Margaret replied, echoing something Robert had often said. "It's about connecting, human to human." After breakfast, they walked together to Margaret's modest two-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood. The garden shed stood at the back of her small yard, freshly painted blue with white trim. Inside, Margaret had created a simple but comfortable space: a cot with clean linens, a small table with a lamp, a shelf with a few books, a space heater, even a tiny microwave. "It's not much," she repeated, suddenly self-conscious. Jack stood in the center of the shed, turning slowly to take in every detail. "It's everything," he said quietly. That night, knowing Jack was safe and warm just yards from her back door, Margaret slept more peacefully than she had in 2 years. The new arrangement developed its own rhythm. Jack kept to himself most of the time, respectful of Margaret's privacy, but they shared evening tea in her kitchen when the winter darkness fell early. He insisted on earning his keep, clearing snow from her walkway, fixing the leaky faucet that had dripped since Robert's death, splitting firewood for her rarely used fireplace. Gradually, Jack began to look different. He trimmed his beard, washed his clothes at the laundromat down the street, stood straighter. With regular meals and proper rest, his face filled out, revealing handsome features that had been obscured by hardship. Margaret found herself looking forward to their evening conversations, to having someone to share her thoughts with again. She noticed other changes in herself too. She took more care with her appearance, started baking again, even called old friends she'd been avoiding. One evening in late January, as they sat by the fireplace drinking tea, Jack cleared his throat. "Margaret, there's something I need to tell you." The seriousness in his tone made her set down her cup. "What is it?" "I haven't been entirely honest with you," he began, staring into the flames. "About who I am, who I was." Margaret felt a flicker of apprehension. She'd invited this man into her life knowing almost nothing about him. "My name is John Jackson Harrington," he said. "Jack Harrington." The name meant nothing to Margaret, and her blank expression made Jack continue. "I founded Harrington Technologies, the software company." Recognition dawned. Even Margaret, who rarely paid attention to business news, knew of Harrington Technologies, a pioneer in security software worth billions. "But that would make you—" She trailed off, unable to reconcile the homeless man she'd met with the corporate titan he claimed to be. "A billionaire, yes." Jack, or John, looked down at his hands. "Or I was. The company still exists, still bears my name, but I walked away from it all 3 years ago." Margaret sat in stunned silence as Jack told his story, how he'd built his company from nothing, becoming obsessed with its success at the expense of everything else, how his wife had died of cancer while he was at a business meeting he'd refused to cancel, how his daughter, Eliza, had grown distant, resentful of always coming second to his empire. "The day Eliza told me she was pregnant with my first grandchild, she also told me she didn't want me in her life anymore. Or in her child's life." His voice cracked. "She said I wouldn't know how to love them properly." The final breaking point had come at a board meeting. In the middle of a presentation about quarterly projections, Jack had suffered what he thought was a heart attack, a severe panic attack, the doctors later explained. "I realized I'd built this massive company, made more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, and for what? I had no one to share it with." Nothing that mattered. He looked up at Margaret, his eyes pleading for understanding. So I walked away. Left everything to Eliza, though she doesn't know it's being held in trust. Took nothing but some cash. I wanted to understand what really mattered in life before it was too late. And did you? Margaret asked softly. Find what matters? A sad smile touched his lips. Sitting here with you by this fire? Yes. I think I finally did. Margaret's mind reeled with questions. But why stay homeless? Why suffer when you didn't have to? At first it was penance, Jack admitted. Then it became a kind of clarity. When you have nothing, you see clearly who will still treat you like a human being. His eyes held hers. People like you, Margaret. She remembered their first meeting, how she'd acted on impulse to buy lunch for a homeless stranger, how that simple act had somehow led them here. I need to find my daughter, Jack continued, to try to make amends if she'll let me. To meet my grandchild. He hesitated. But I wanted you to know the truth first. You deserve that much. Margaret sat with this revelation, this reframing of everything she thought she knew about Jack. Part of her felt foolish, even deceived. But looking at the man before her, the same person who had carved her a wooden bird, who listened to her stories about Robert with genuine interest, who had brought warmth back into her life, she found she couldn't summon real anger. Why tell me now? She finally asked. Because I care about you too much to keep lying, he said simply. And because I'd like to take you to dinner tomorrow night? A proper dinner, not at Rosie's diner? If you'll still have anything to do with me. Margaret studied his face, the same blue eyes that had first caught her attention, now anxious and hopeful. The man who had been both less and more than he appeared. I'll need time to process this, she said honestly. Jack nodded, accepting her response without protest. Of course. Take all the time you need. That night, Margaret lay awake thinking about trust and deception, about the strange paths that led people into each other's lives, about second chances and whether people deserved them. By morning, she had her answer. Jack was splitting wood when she approached him, the rhythmic thunk of the axe punctuating the crisp winter air. Dinner, she said when he paused, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. I'd like that. But as Margaret and Jack, not as a widow and a billionaire. Just us as we've come to know each other. The relief on his face was answer enough. That evening, Jack arrived at her door in clothes she'd never seen, a tailored suit that transformed him completely. He'd visited a barber, his beard neatly trimmed, his hair cut. For a moment, Margaret hardly recognized him. Then he smiled, and he was just Jack again, the man who had become her friend. He took her to an elegant restaurant overlooking the harbor, where the maitre d' greeted him by name with a deference that confirmed his story. Over candlelight they talked as they always had, but with a new openness, the barrier of Jack's secret now removed. What happens now? Margaret asked as they lingered over dessert. Will you go back to your old life? Jack shook his head. Not the way it was, no. But I've been thinking about using my resources differently. Starting a foundation perhaps to help people transitioning out of homelessness. People who just need a garden shed and a second chance. His eyes held hers. Would you consider helping me with that? Margaret thought about how her life had narrowed after Robert's death, how she'd been merely existing until a chance encounter at a diner had reminded her what it felt like to truly live again. I would, she said. On one condition? Name it. That you try to reconcile with your daughter first. Family is too precious to lose, Jack. If there's any chance to repair that relationship, you need to take it. Jack reached across the table, his hand covering hers as hers had once covered his in Rosie's diner. I was hoping you'd say that, he said. I found her address. She's living in Seattle now. I've been working up the courage to contact her. Perhaps a letter first, Margaret suggested. Words on paper can be read and reread, considered carefully. In the weeks that followed, Margaret helped Jack craft his letter to Eliza, a message of apology, of explanation, of hope, but not expectation. When he finally mailed it, Margaret held his hand as they watched the mail carrier take it away. Now we wait, she said. While they waited, Jack began planning his foundation. He rented a small office downtown, consulted with experts on homelessness, drafted mission statements and program outlines. Margaret found herself drawn into his vision, offering practical insights from her brief but meaningful experience of helping one person transition from the streets. They continued their Saturday breakfasts at Rosie's diner, now a cherished ritual rather than a chance encounter. Jack insisted on keeping the garden shed as his residence, though Margaret knew he'd quietly rented an apartment downtown for his business meetings. "The shed keeps me grounded," he explained. "Reminds me of what matters." 3 months after mailing the letter, Jack's phone rang with a Seattle area code. Margaret watched as he answered, his hand trembling, his voice steady as he said, "Hello, Eliza." The conversation was brief, tentative, but ended with plans for Jack to visit the following month. When he hung up, tears streamed freely down his face. "She's willing to see me," he said in wonder. "She has a son. His name is John." When the time came for Jack to fly to Seattle, Margaret drove him to the airport. "Come with me," he said impulsively as they stood at the departure gate. "I've told Eliza about you. How you changed everything for me." Margaret shook her head gently. "This reunion needs to be just family," she said. "But I'll be here when you get back." 5 days later, when Jack returned, he came directly to Margaret's house from the airport. She opened the door to find him standing there with red-rimmed eyes and a smile that outshone the spring sunshine. "She let me hold him," he said without preamble. "My grandson. He has my eyes." That night, as they sat in Margaret's garden watching the first stars appear, Jack reached for her hand. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said that first day at the diner, about how sometimes we all need a little warmth." Margaret smiled at the memory. "I was just trying to preserve your dignity. You did more than that," Jack said, turning to face her. "You saved me, Margaret. Not from homelessness, I could have ended that any time. You saved me from the cold I'd created in my own life." He produced a small box from his pocket. Inside was not a ring, as Margaret had momentarily feared, but a delicate silver pendant in the shape of a cardinal, similar to the wooden one he'd carved for her. "I'm not asking for anything more than what we have," he said as he fastened it around her neck. "Friendship. Purpose. The chance to see where this unexpected path might lead us." His fingers lingered at the nape of her neck. "But I want you to know that meeting you was the best thing that's happened to me in 20 years. Margaret touched the pendant, thinking of how a simple act of kindness in a diner had somehow led to this moment, to renewed purpose, to connection, to the warmth of possibility in her life again. "A lonely widow bought a homeless man lunch," she said softly, never knowing he was a billionaire in disguise. But more importantly, never knowing he would become her dearest friend. Jack's smile deepened the creases around his eyes that saw her, truly saw her. "And what happens next in the story?" he asked. Margaret looked up at the emerging stars, then back at the man beside her, a man who had lost everything and found something more valuable in the process. A man who, like her, had been given an unexpected second chance. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But for the first time in a long time, I'm looking forward to finding out." In the garden behind Margaret's modest house, as spring coaxed new life from the soil, two people who had once been defined by their losses sat together in comfortable silence, watching darkness give way to light, one star at a time.